Hello and welcome to talk number 4 of our virtual panel series, Opera and Conversation. Today we are absolutely delighted to be joined by Oliver Mears, who is the current Director of Opera at the Royal Opera House. Before joining the Royal Opera House, Oliver Mears was the Artistic Director at Northern Ireland Opera, and in 2004 he co-founded the London-based opera company Second Movement and directed numerous site-specific productions. He's here to talk to us more about his work, his experience, and give us more information and knowledge about his career in the opera industry. Any budding directors out there, this is a great time to be asking your questions. And as always, we have our live chat enabled on YouTube, so please feel free to ask any questions and we'll communicate them. So without any further ado, I'd like to hand over to Zelina, President of Oxford Contemporary Opera, to start us off.
Great, thank you so much, Priya, and welcome. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our fourth talk in this series, Opera in Conversation. My name is Zelina Vulliamy. I am taking you through our discussion today with Oliver Mears, who is the director of the Opera House. Thank you so much for joining us, Oliver.
Hi, guys. Hi, everyone.
So I've started all of these talks by asking the same question, which is essentially, why opera? Why did you choose to go into opera? What attracted you about it?
Well, look, I've always been interested in classical music ever since I was a kid, but I didn't really have a serious interest until I was in opera, until I'd actually left university. I'd never seen an opera till quite late, till I was 21. And the first opera that I ever saw was Katya Kabanova here at the Opera House. And the combination of that fabulous music and that very theatrical plot got me really, really intrigued. Now, I'd also, before then, become very interested in directing plays in particular. And while I would listen to the occasional opera, I hadn't seen one yet, there were certain ones that really stood out for me, like Lady Macbeth and Sense by Shostakovich, which is still probably my favorite opera, Don Giovanni, Tristan and Isolde. So I was interested, but it was only once I'd actually seen one and thought about the possibilities of that total art form, all of the different art forms combined, as Wagner talked about, that I became interested in pursuing it potentially as a career as well.
Excellent. Yeah, I definitely understand what you mean about the sort of interest in the immersive total art form. But I'm very interested to hear that you didn't actually see opera until quite late, because I feel like often when I've spoken to people about opera, they've often cited, seeing Don Giovanni at age 10 or something as being the main inspiration. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about your experience directing. So you also, like me, are an Oxford graduate, and I was wondering how you got into directing when you were at university and what kind of plays you were doing and what sort of interests you had.
Yeah, well, I didn't really mean to be a director. The thing that I always wanted to be was a writer. And I kind of fell into directing by accident. And what happened was, I don't know if they still have this at Oxford, but there was this thing called the Cuppers Festival, which was in the first term of your first year at Oxford. And for some reason, I can't even remember why, someone asked me to write a play, a short play, a half an hour play. And I wrote this piece, and there was no one to direct it. So I decided that I would have to direct it myself. And I found that quite a fun thing to do. I didn't think that it was going to be a serious thing that I would be doing for years to come. And there was also an awards outcome to the Cuppers Festival. Maybe there still is. And it won an award for Best New Play. And I thought, oh, well, that's maybe quite interesting. Maybe I could do this directing thing a little bit more. And in the end, I directed something like 10 plays when I was at Oxford. I really didn't do very much solid work between my first term and my penultimate term, maybe. And in that time, I did things like The Government Inspector and Tis Pity She's a Whore and lots of other shows. And really, it was about gaining an experience, a practical experience of putting on work and working with people in the room. And also, there's a kind of producing aspect to it as well, because you've got to fundraise the money yourself and find the right venue and deal with the technical side of things as well. So it's a great practical way of going about it, doing that number of shows in quite a few different venues over quite a long period of time. And I probably look back in embarrassment on the actual shows themselves, but I certainly learned a lot from that process. And in retrospect, very grateful that my college was able to give me the time that I needed to do those things. And at the same time, I also was doing that thing that you do when you're starting out your career, that you write to lots and lots of people. And I was very fortunate that one of the letters I wrote reached the desk of the playwright Howard Barker, and I started assisting him when I was still at university. And that really got me on the path of being an assistant director. And for the next few years, I was pursuing that parallel career of being an assistant and learning from a lot of really brilliant directors, and maybe some not so brilliant directors too. It's all part of the process. And directing whenever I could as well. But certainly that Oxford experience was a really pivotal one for me.
I'm really glad to hear that. Yeah, I can report that Cuppers is still happening, and I'm very grateful to my own college for helping me sort of put on the operas that I've done. So I was wondering then, what was the first opera that you directed, and how do you find it as a different process to theatre directing?
Well, as I said before, I'd always been interested in opera, and I'd had this love for Don Giovanni as a piece to do, which you'll know about, being called Selina. And we had discussed the idea of me directing it at some point, but of course it's a huge undertaking to put on an opera. It's quite different to doing a play, because you've got to have the orchestra and the chorus, and you've got to have a venue that's big enough. And for whatever reason, it never really happened. And also, I'd never seen an opera, so it probably wasn't the right thing to do anyway. But as soon as I left, I was determined to direct plays still and to direct operas. And again, you're confronted by the problem of scale. When you're starting out as a director, you're confronted by the challenge of raising money, because you do have to have a certain amount of money to put an orchestra together, to put staging together, to find a venue. And I was very fortunate that I had a friend from Oxford who wanted to be a conductor, and I was already doing a bit of conducting at university. And I also had a friend who was a really fantastic producer called Abigail Toland. And the three of us got together and we worked out a plan for putting on work for the next few years. And we particularly wanted to do work that was going to have a really direct aesthetic that would appeal to young people, especially, and that would maybe try and do opera in a different way. So we would move away from the kind of red plush seating venues to found spaces, site-specific venues, and we would do operas that were shorter than most operas were, because of course one of the big challenges that opera faces in terms of perception is that it's very long and boring. So we wanted to do one-act operas, and we wanted to do them in English, and we wanted to do them with young performers who are not only great singers but really good actors too. So we found an aesthetic that we wanted to pursue with this company, Second Movement, and then it was just about finding the right piece and finding the money to do it. And of course, we started with one of the smallest operas that there is, which is Mozart and Salieri, which is quite a rare piece by Rimsky-Korsakov. It's just a two-hander, essentially. Reasonably small band, and we did it in the Grosvenor Chapel in Mayfair, very atmospheric 18th century venue, and we had some very generous support from a couple of donors, one donor in particular, and that enabled us to pay. I think that our total budget was something like £10,000, which is not a small sum, but it's quite big when you're starting out, and that enabled us to put on the first show which any of us had done actually, and it was a really great thing to do, and then we gradually worked up from there.
Wow, what an interesting progression. Thank you so much for sharing that. I mean, so you've just mentioned quite a focus on accessibility, both in terms of moving away from, the plush theatrical space like at the Opera House to more kind of different spaces. So I was wondering if accessibility, if you would say that is a priority in your directorial style, really.
Yeah, I would. I mean, look, probably every director would say the same thing, wouldn't they? I mean, every director wants to communicate, and probably every director wants to communicate as directly as possible. And I guess if there's a thread in the work that I've done over the years and that connects Second Movement to what I'm hoping to do now at the Opera House, is that what I want to do is to create really brilliant experiences for the audience, and for them to be moved and gripped and engaged in a way that is not always the case in opera. Let's face it, opera can be, when it's bad, really, really tedious. And it can be very, very long, and it can be, in terms of acting quality, it can be very stand and deliver. And there are lots of elements that can be alienating. For example, the language can be alienating, even if you've got the subtitles up there on the screen. For some people, it can put people off. And then, of course, there's the whole association of opera with the class system and luxury and privilege and elitism. And I think that when you get down to the fundamentals of what opera is and what's exciting about it is that you've got people doing what very, very few people can do at an exceptional level live, so it can never be repeated, in a way, in a form that's very, very communal. So it's a collective experience. And I think that that's what's fundamental about it. And really, when you strip everything away, it's not about status, and it's not about showing your wealth, and it's not about all those opera cliches that we're familiar with from cartoons or adverts, for example. It's about something much more primal than that. And it's about how you strip away those layers that you don't really need. It's about how you get the core musical experience, but also the core theatrical experience. And I think that the least people should demand when they go to the theatre, because after all, this is a theatre, not a concert hall, is great drama. And in doing so, you've got to be really honest with yourself and say, is the acting as good as it can be? Is it as authentic as it can be? Is the design allowing the audience to enter this place of enchantment or provocation? Is it somewhere that people can experience very, very immaculate theatrical standards as well as immaculate musical standards? So I think that these are the questions we have to ask ourselves in the service of making an experience that is as immediate and as moving and hopefully as overwhelming as opera should be.
Certainly. I really agree with your emphasis on kind of communicating the drama there. I think so often people do mistake opera as a kind of concert hall art form. And I think to place emphasis on its theatricality is so important. So I was wondering if, and this is quite a big question, but if you would mind taking us through your process as a director from the moment that the piece that you're going to direct is decided to then it eventually being on the stage. And I was wondering within that, how much of a focus do you place on communicating something to the audience?
Well, big questions. Yeah. Well, look, it's got to communicate to the audience for sure, because otherwise it's meaningless as a work of art, and certainly as a work of theatre. But ultimately, the first step, I think, has got to be that it's got to communicate to you as a director, as a practitioner, and it's got to move you. You've got to be engaged by the material, and I think that's the first step. Is, of course, when you're asked to do a piece, it's a little bit different, and you listen to it and you think, well, maybe this is something I could tackle. But in an ideal scenario, you'd be so enthralled by a piece and so determined to get it on that you would find a way of doing that, or you would have a choice in the pieces that you do. And of course, the directors at the very, very, very top level are very fortunate enough to have that choice, that they get to choose the pieces that they do often. But you've got to have that emotional connection with the piece. At some level, you've got to have the same degree of emotional reaction to it, an urgent emotional reaction to it, as the composer did when they wrote it. And to kind of explain what I mean, in my view, the great operas that exist out there have come from a place of really psychic urgency on the part of the composer. They had to write these pieces. There was no option but for them to write them. And it may have been a crisis in their personal life. It may have been a relationship they were going through or had just gone through. It may have been a very particular political situation that they were experiencing. You mentioned Lady Macbeth and Macbeth earlier. It could have been any number of reasons, but they were compelled to write a piece. And the degree of urgency with which they were compelled is usually reflected in the intensity of the music. And the intensity of the music is then communicated to the audience as something which is very, very special and unique and overpowering. It should be, as I said before. So once you've got that initial emotional response to the piece, then your responsibility, I think, as a director is to listen to it endlessly, almost on repeat, so that you understand the music as well as you possibly can and not fall into the trap of approaching it as a play, because operas aren't plays. The text is not the most important thing. The music is the thing that communicates the emotions and the feelings. And ultimately opera and music has to be about emotion and feeling. That's why we go to the opera house. We go there to be moved. So it's about understanding all of the different emotional colours in the piece and responding to their meaning, and gradually through that process finding a way through to staging it. And the more you listen to it and the more also background research that you do, particularly for me, this may not be everyone's approach, but for me, learning about the composer and why they wanted to write it, why they had to write it, that for me is a really fantastic way in to interpreting it. Actually, for me, that's absolutely essential to interpreting a piece, is knowing why the composer wrote it. And the more research you do, the more books you read, the more associated research you do, the more pictures you look at, gradually something tends to emerge to the surface of your consciousness, because everything has to kind of settle a little in your unconscious, and gradually things will emerge that give you an idea of what you're going to do in terms of shaping it on stage. And that should be a process that also happens with the conductor and the designer as well. Those are the other two key figures, and the costume designer as well. That as you're becoming clear in what your approach is, that you have those conversations with collaborators, because it is the ultimate collaborative art form, because it's the ultimate total art form, you know, as we talked about before, because it involves so many different elements that have to be really perfect in and of themselves, but also really unified and coherent. You've got to have those conversations. You can't work in isolation. So as things become clearer for you, you talk to the conductor, you talk to the designer about your ideas and their ideas and how they might mesh. And hopefully that will lead you to a point where you have a strong concept. You've got a very strong idea of the characters. You feel that you can talk about the characters in a way that will be helpful for the singers, because, you know, your responsibility, you know, you have to assume that the singers, they've learned the roles, but they won't necessarily have done much more work than that in terms of characters or reading around those characters. So your responsibility is to bring into the rehearsal room other ideas, other notions of that character, but also to really know what you want. I was fortunate that I worked with one of my sisters was an actress, and when I was starting out at Oxford, and I was saying to her, you know, as an actor, as a performer, what do you look for from a director? As she said, there are two things that I look from a director. First of all, I look for someone who has ideas, and secondly, I look for someone who knows what they want. And that's not about being dictatorial in the room, but it's about having a really strong sense when you go into the rehearsal room of, I know what I want to do with this piece. You know, there are, some directors are different. I mean, everyone's got a different working practice. I mean, particularly coming from the theatre, some theatre directors, particularly, and that's a consequence of the amount of time that you have, will be much more interested in discovering something with actors. And that's much more possible when you've got 8 weeks to play. But normally opera rehearsal schedules are much more contracted than that. You may only have 3 or 4 weeks. So there isn't as much time to play. And that means that you need to come into the room with I believe, a much firmer idea of what you want. And also singers in general, I think, less so than actors, more so than actors, tend to want structure. They tend to appreciate direction more in the old-fashioned sense of that word. Whereas actors are very, very happy to improvise, and they'll bring lots of thoughts and inspirations to the table in terms of how they might move on stage. Opera singers, I've found, tend to really appreciate a degree of guidance in that. So that's kind of long-winded answer to your question, from the kind of conceptual stage to the practical stage. But for me, it is about immersion in the opera, in the world of the opera, and then finding a way through that you can communicate the ideas that have settled in your mind to the performers to bring the best out of them, because that's ultimately your role as a director, is to allow them to give of their best on stage, because it can be a frightening place out there, especially when you've got to remember all those notes and project to the back of the theatre. It's, you know, it's difficult, and I think that as a director you've got to be there to help them, not be a hindrance or to impose something which is not going to enable them to give of their best.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, thank you for sharing that kind of progression from having the concept and understanding the music to then working with the performers. I was wondering, in that sense, what is the first thing that you do when you get everyone in the rehearsal room for the first time?
Well, first of all, you've got to explain what your ideas for the piece are. So just at a very basic level, what's the world that we're in? What are the physical parameters of the stage? What is the development through the course of the piece? And I think that most of the time it's also a very good place to start with the original, to give broad brushstrokes in terms of, as I said before, why was the composer writing this piece? What was significant about it in the era that it was staged? And then to talk about the source of the piece, because usually there is a source. It might be a Shakespeare play, it might be another play, it might be a libretto which was specially written. But I think talking about that is often helpful, going back to the original source and reading the original source if it was a play. Thinking about why it was cut in the way that it was, because invariably plays are cut to make them the suitable length they need to be for opera. So just the sheer process of why did the composer or the librettist cut in that way can be really revealing about what their priorities were, and therefore what you as an interpreter's priorities should be. And then there should be, I think, a period of a day or two at least, a few days of thinking about what the backstory of each of the characters is. To go back to the Stanislavski model of exploring what the actions are in each section of the scene, what the beats are in a scene, and really to do a deep dive into what the journey of the characters across the piece is, and also to have a really a strong understanding of subtext. It was Stanislavski who said, audiences go to the theatre to hear the subtext. They can read the subtext at home. They can read the play at home. And I think that a real focused concentration of that when you're going through the text can be really illuminating, actually. But then it's good not to spend too much time around the table. I think that it's good to get up on your feet and to sketch out some ideas and some movements. And then should be a process of negotiation. What's going to work for the character, what's going to work for the performer, and also what's going to work in terms of your pictorial ideas, because I think that is important. I'm quite interested in making pictures on stage, and sometimes that can be distrusted, particularly in the theatre world. But I was very influenced by, the person I was really excited by when I was younger, and now actually, in terms of directors, Meyerhold, the Russian director. And obviously, unfortunately, none of the shows that he did were ever recorded, I believe. But there are these fabulous photos from the 1920s and 30s, particularly that kind of constructivist era. And they're so expressive of those plays, but also of the ideas that he was communicating in those productions. And you can really see a kind of guiding hand, and you can see someone who was interested in what the total picture was on stage. Some directors aren't interested in that, and that's also fine. They will be much more interested in other things. But that's something that interests me. So again, kind of allowing it for an approach that enables the performers to feel that they have agency, and that they can bring their ideas, and bringing your ideas, melding those two things together with also a kind of a sense of the coherence of the stage offering is that's the kind of alchemy, really. And it's not always straightforward, but that's the ambition.
Yeah, I certainly think that creating a space where singers are able to feel like their ideas matter and do count towards the characterization, I think is really important. So going on from this, I noticed that you actually worked as a staff director at the Opera House. I was wondering if you could tell us what the difference is between a staff director and what we normally associate the qualities of being a sort of a director in the other sense.
Well, as an assistant director, really, yeah. Well, it's interesting. I guess there's a sort of almost a distinction you need to make between the responsibilities of an assistant director and the things that you learn from being an assistant director. And the things that you need to be good at as an assistant director aren't necessarily the things you need to be good at as a director. For example, you need to be meticulous in terms of scheduling. You need to have a really strong level of discretion, I think, in the rehearsal room. And by discretion, I kind of mean discretion in the largest sense, that it's not only about being discreet about process and not being gassing away about things that probably don't need to be talked about, but it's also about being sensitive to the challenges that exist for any director in the room. Most people are new to a piece, they're directing it, or they're often singing it for the first time. They're certainly singing it in your production or director's production for the first time, often. And so it's about being sensitive to that. And it's also about not wanting to impose your own ideas. I mean, especially when you're a young director, you've got loads and loads of ideas that you want to put out there and that you want to stage and that you want to realize. But you can't do that in a rehearsal room when you're assisting. Your job is to serve the director and to do as much listening as you can, and to learn from the process and take from the process as much as you possibly can. And as I said before, that you learn the most from the brilliant directors, of course, but you also learn from the experiences that aren't so good. I think it's not always an easy job being an assistant director, because the reason you're an assistant director is because you want to be a director, but it doesn't allow you to do that. So you're quite constrained in that sense. But if you can be open-minded and take from it what you can, and think of it as a kind of learning and a listening experience, then you can learn a lot. I mean, the other thing as a director, as an assistant director, is that you may be called upon to revive the show at a later point, and that's why you need to be really, really meticulous in terms of keeping a book. And in fact, in opera, there's often a bigger chance of the opera happening again, being revived, than there is with a play. Often when a play is done, that's the last time that it will be done. But in opera, they usually are revived because it's such an investment to do them. So that's a skill in and of itself, is recording the blocking and the lighting and so on and so forth. So it's a different set of tasks, but it's a great way to learn.
Certainly, yeah. I mean, I hope to do assistant directing at some point myself. So Oliver Mears, you were appointed the artistic director or director of opera at the Royal Opera House in 2017. I was wondering, when you started the role, if you had any specific goals, and looking back, whether you think you are achieving them.
Yeah, of course. I mean, there are lots of things that you want to achieve when you enter an organisation and an institution, and what you also have to be is really aware of the fact that an institution like the Royal Opera House it's an enormous thing. I mean, someone compared it recently to an aircraft carrier, changing the direction of an aircraft carrier is quite a lengthy and laborious process. Nevertheless, you can have priorities that you want to pursue, and one of the priorities for me was to create the kind of work that would engage with as many people as possible, and to create work that was as direct as possible, and also work that for me had a really strong identity. And I think that the situation with the Royal Opera House is an interesting one, because it is an international house, and it is also a house that for 300 years has been known for brilliant singers from wherever they come from all over the world. I mean, that's going right back to the 1730s when the first operas were put on here. But at the same time, it is an institution that's based in London, and that throws up all sorts of expectations in terms of the way in which theatre is made. As I said before, in terms of the way in which just very basic things like acting is important, the way in which people receive different styles of productions in London, very different to, for example, the way in which productions might be received in Munich or London or Berlin. And so I think it's about an approach that never lectures the audience, that never condescends to the audience or patronizes the audience. It's an approach that prioritizes narrative clarity wherever possible. And I think that within that, you can do all sorts of exciting things. I don't think you necessarily have to be literal. In fact, I think the literal approach is a real enemy of opera as an art form. That you just stage what is on the page. I mean, how boring is that? But I think there is a responsibility to the audience, no matter what concept you come up with, that it has to be really, really brilliantly thought through. And it really has to have a really strong internal logic. And it has to have a coherence and a through line. So I think my responsibility, my primary responsibility is to create work that will do all of those things. And therefore prioritize practitioners who can make that kind of work. And each director of opera will have priorities in terms of the practitioners they work with. My predecessor did, and my predecessor before that did. So that's a big part of what the role is, I think. And also really making it the kind of opera house that felt like it belonged to this city. And what does that mean? Well, it means that it's a very cosmopolitan city. We're already doing that in terms of the singers and the artists who are working here. But it's also a city which is 40% non-white now. So I think we have a huge responsibility in terms of the diversity of our performers and the diversity of our practitioners. And that's a long and important journey that we're going on now. And also in terms of the history of this place, we were founded in the late 1940s, at the same time as the National Health Service. What does that tell you? Well, it tells you that we have a responsibility to make work for everyone in the way that the founders envisioned it. The opera and ballet was for everyone. If you're making it for an elite, if it's conceived for an elite, then I think that you're failing. And I think that was really, really fundamental. And again, just going back over the centuries, the practitioners who made an impact here were always making work for the people, going right back to Handel, then through to the 1940s, and then through to the 1970s when there were the Midland Bank proms, when they took out the seats in the stalls here, and you could stand up and you could sit down on blankets in the auditorium. There's always been this very strong element of trying to make this a people's house. So somehow marrying up the fact that the Royal Opera House, for good or ill, is this kind of luxury brand in a way, with creating work that communicates with as large an audience as possible. I mean, that was kind of my biggest priority. And as I say, that through line with the work that I started out with, it has been a really consistent and important thing, both here and previously.
I think many of us kind of, if I can speak for young people interested in opera, we really appreciate that kind of focus that you've just spoken of. You mentioned that the Royal Opera House is kind of associated with a luxury brand. I was wondering how different it was to go from your previous role at Northern Ireland Opera to the Royal Opera House in terms of funding, and how much influence does private philanthropic funding have on the choice of repertoire that you might choose in the Opera House?
Well, it's a very different form of funding, and the funding thing is a really interesting thing, because in Northern Ireland and on the continent, the level of subsidy was a much higher. It was a much higher proportion of income than at the Royal Opera House, or for that matter, any American opera house company that you might think of, where it's much more philanthropically based. I mean, here, our largest single source of income is box office. And aside from that, we do have a very generous grant from the Arts Council, which has diminished as a proportion of income over the years, but it's still 20 million that goes to the opera and the ballet companies. And that entails certain responsibilities in terms of risk-taking and other areas of social responsibility. But then on the other hand, in order to make up for that in a way, the philanthropy has grown enormously in the last few years. I mean, it's a terrific sign of how brilliantly the development department have done in the last few years, that has grown in the way that it has. I mean, we're fortunate in our philanthropists will want to support certain projects more than others, inevitably. But they would never, ever say, we won't support the Royal Opera House unless you put on traditional productions, for example. I hear that has occasionally happened in America. But we're very, very far away from that model. And I think that the interesting thing about the mixed funding model is that it means we have to appeal and justify ourselves to several different constituencies. And I don't think that's any bad thing. Our donors and our friends, they're a terrifically varied group of people. Of course, there are some traditionalists in there, but there are also some who really want to see the latest modern piece and will support the latest modern piece that we do, the latest contemporary piece. As I talked about, the Arts Council really want us to be risk-taking in our repertoire, but also progressive in terms of things like diversity I mentioned. And then box office, our dependence on that box office income means that we do have to look at the bottom line and think, is this a piece that's going to appeal to a large audience? We're not in a situation, as is the case in certainly in Germany or Austria, where you can put on more or less endless productions of Boulevard Solitude or Mahagoni, and the audience may be 50 or 60%, but ultimately you don't have to worry about that because your main source of income is your government subsidy. We're so far away from that. I mean, you had Barry Kosky on recently, and again, it's a very, very different funding model. And I think that in Berlin, this is a side note really, I think in Berlin opera funding is in total more than the entire Arts Council grant for England. I mean, it's extraordinary how well funded opera is over there, and I'm not complaining about that. It'd be a lovely thing to have. And in some ways, as I say, it's a good thing that we have those three main sources of income, because it means that we have to be really agile and really aware of different priorities when we make our work. But yes, but in answer to your question about Northern Ireland, it's certainly a very different situation because subsidy was a much larger part of the story there, which meant that in some ways one had more flexibility to do what you wanted because you weren't so tied into making large sums of money at the box office.
Mm. Yeah, thank you. That's very illuminating. I was glad to hear that you mention a focus on kind of contemporary repertoire. Obviously, this society was founded with that kind of aim of introducing students and our wider community to opera, which has more contemporary, modern kind of political themes. So I just wanted to turn to the recent projects that the Opera House have done, partly, I guess, in response to the global pandemic we've all experienced this year. So I was wondering if you could talk me through the projects that you've done recently, such as New Dark Age and the 4 different operas. And I was wondering, were these in a direct response to the pandemic, and how did you find curating all of these different things together?
Yeah, they were. They were conceived as a direct response to the situation that we found ourselves in. And I mean, let's make no bones about it. I mean, COVID-19 has been a disaster for opera and theatre all over the world. And when one thinks about all the projects that have been cancelled and the dreams that have been rubbed out in the last few months, it's really tragic to contemplate those. But as soon as we realised that we were in a situation where we had drastically less income, drastically less resource than we did before, and where there were these COVID restrictions, not only in terms of socially distanced audiences, which did mean that we had much less box office income coming in, speaking of box office, but that we also had to work in a way that was COVID safe, that we couldn't have the bread and butter pieces on our stage simply because they were not safe in the middle of a pandemic, in a respiratory pandemic. So we can't do full stagings of Verdi and Wagner in particular. We can't have a full pit, we can't have a chorus on stage moving around. But of course, as an artistic institution, we have a responsibility to be as agile as we can be and to work with those challenges, to use the difficulty, as someone once said. And that led us to think about the kind of works that would work in that context, and to think about pieces that maybe weren't even operas, and that would never normally be on the Royal Opera House stage. That is in itself quite a thrilling thing to think about. The fact that some of these pieces would never see the light of day on our stage were it not for these extreme circumstances. And also it was interesting putting particularly 4/4 together because it reminded me of my second movement days, where we were thinking about short pieces that didn't have large cast or choruses, and small orchestrations. It was deja vu really in that sense, and it felt like a kind of quite a comfortable place because lots of these pieces had already been thought about or contemplated before. Certainly 4/4 was an opportunity to showcase those pieces, but also to really hone in on, again, that question of identity. Who are the practitioners who most said Covent Garden? Who are the practitioners who could really realize opera as a theatre event and not just as a musical event? Who would be able to communicate work that had a brilliantly clear narrative, that had a sense of humour, which is often missing from opera, particularly on the continent sometimes. And as I say, while working COVID safe. So it was great that, we managed to get this team of directors, Rich Jones and Deborah Warner, Del Thomas, Anthony MacDonald, and give them very clear parameters, that we were in a difficult place here, and we could only have 1 or 2 people on stage at any one point. These are the pieces that could work. And they also chipped in with their own ideas, some of which we used. And in the end, it was a great thing that they worked within the challenges that were set. They worked with very, very minimal resource. And it was great also that we could feature Britten and Handel, who we like to think of as our house composers, because of course they wrote so many pieces for Covent Garden, with Apollo and Daphne and Phaedra in there. So it really felt that there was a kind of a distillation of everything that's important about this place, and that we used artists who were really important to this place, and managed to create something that lots of people really loved, and they were really moved to be back in the building just before the second lockdown, and that was a great thing. And then with New Dark Age, that this was an opportunity for us to do again pieces that would never normally be staged on the main stage here, and to work with the kind of practitioners who really, to be quite honest with you, have not been prioritised enough in Covent Garden's history. I mean, The Knife of Dawn by Hannah Kendall was only the 3rd opera by a woman that's ever been staged on the main stage of Covent Garden in 300 years. I mean, that's quite an extraordinary and shaming fact, and that's something that we wanted to change. And again, it was great to have Ola Ince, who was making her main stage debut as a director, and Jonathan Hayward conducting, alongside Katie Mitchell, who's done several productions for the Royal Opera House, but again brings a very, very unique aesthetic. And I think that what was interesting about those pieces as well was, what is the challenge of COVID for opera as an art form? It's not just about working safe, it's also about how you work responsibly or ethically in the current situation. I mean, for me, the era of extravagant sets feels to me over. It feels like it wouldn't be right to make some of the shows that we have made in the last 30 years, which were absolutely right for their time, and we've still got them in our repertory. But it feels to me not the right time to splurge money on anything now, and to watch our resources, and to be responsible in that way, and also be aware of the environmental impact of our work. I mean, one of the things that's really been clear from this whole thing is the impact, for example, that pollution has on the world that we live in, and in turn, the health outcomes from pollution with regard to COVID. And opera is an international art form, and people are flying here, there, and everywhere, as though there's no tomorrow. And certainly before the pandemic hit, maybe not so much now, but I think now is a moment to reflect on how we make work, whether we can make work that's even more distilled, that is conscious of ethical parameters, as well as resource parameters, and maybe that doesn't eat up so much the planet's resources that we did before. So I think that's been a good thing, and I think that making those shorter pieces in October has been really illuminating in that way.
Yeah, I really agree with you on so many of those points. I mean, do you think therefore that 2020 will usher in a new sort of form of opera performance in that sense?
I think there's the possibility for that. I think for us it's difficult because 2/3 of our repertoire in any one season is revivals. So we have this very large historical rep that goes back to the early 1980s. In the case of Turandot, for example, that's our oldest production. I think 1984 it was. And we don't have the money just to junk all those shows and to replace them with new ones. So it will be a slow process, but I think that potentially, I think that our projects could look different. And that's not to say that we shouldn't, at the same time, really acknowledge that this place should be this place should be a magical portal where people can escape, where people are enchanted. And there is always, people talk about escapism. And I think it's fine if people want to come to the Opera House and escape. I'd also like them to be provoked and challenged at times too, but there's no question that people find solace in that, and people find delight in spectacle. So we should never forget that. The fact that the visual should always be part of the seduction of opera. So I'm not saying that everything needs to be done in a black box. That would be very depressing. But just closer scrutiny on, as I say, the way we make productions. And whether sometimes something on stage can be just as electric with hardly anything, as opposed to having big clunky old sets. I think that's just a reflection that we can make at this time. But I think that it would take probably years for the impact of COVID to show, because I think one of the interesting things about COVID is that because every organisation is really on its uppers financially, is really suffering financially, the inevitable push is towards all of the traditional rep that everyone knows and loves, Bohème and Traviata and Carmen, going down that traditional route just to keep the bills paid and the artists paid and the staff paid. So there's a tension there between the radicalism that we'd like to enact and the fact that we are dependent on box office, and box office income is bigger when you do those traditional pieces. So somehow we have to find that right balance. And it may not always be obvious, the big change that we enact, but I think it will happen.
Mm. I mean, one way in which I see a change being enacted, particularly at the Opera House, is in the commission of new projects such as, I think it's Current Rising, which is your first opera, which is in hyper-reality, also, I believe, led by an all-female creative team. Are we going to be seeing more projects like this then in the near future?
Yeah, and I think we have to be really open to different approaches now. I mean, one of the things, of course, that opera has opened up, the pandemic has opened up for opera, I should say, is how you can make opera in a COVID-safe way that isn't necessarily live. And I think that everyone has been very excited about the possibilities for virtual reality opera and augmented reality opera and hyper-reality opera, which is what Current Rising is. And I think that's all great. And I think that people are also talking about live streaming and whether that's a possible solution. I mean, I think it's early days for that. I think probably a lot of people are quite fed up with screens by now, although we're having this conversation on screens, of course. And for me, the kick I get out of opera is when you go into a theatre and you experience it live. I mean, I've never really been much for seeing opera on DVD or a screen. I would much rather go and see it in a theatre and to get that special tingle that you get when you're in a room with thousands of other people. But certainly I think that our digital offer is going to have to accelerate and become much more interesting and engaging, because who knows? I mean, this we're all pinning our hopes on the vaccines, and I'm sure that they will be effective, but no one really knows. And also no one knows whether we might be due more pandemics in the future. And that may mean that we have to be more responsive to working in a different way and producing work in a different way. And that's why I think the hyper-reality project is potentially really interesting as a possible path forward.
Yeah, I think certainly I agree with you. There's nothing that really beats that experience of a live performance, but live streaming concerts or operas or whatever is certainly a very good way of getting around it. We don't have that much time left, so I just wanted to turn to a few other questions.
Sure.
Firstly, I mean, we sort of have touched on it ever so slightly already, but arguably a reason why 2020 has been completely changed our lives in so many ways, I would say, is the growing awareness of racism, and particularly with movements like Black Lives Matter. So I wanted to ask you, do you think that opera has a race problem? And if so, what steps should we take to try and solve it?
Well, there's a question. Yeah, I think that historically, I think certainly opera has had a race problem, and I think you can see it in every manifestation of opera over the 4 centuries that it's been with us. Just purely in the fact that the vast majority of pieces have been written by white men tells you all you need to know about the very especially patriarchal aspect of opera. And also I think that opera there's something which is almost naturally hierarchical, and I think it's to do with the element of that one person being in charge of up to 100 musicians, sometimes more than 100 musicians. The conductor, the authoritarian figure of the conductor, or the authoritarian figure of the director, or the authoritarian figure of the artistic director. I mean, historically, these have been very powerful people, and you can also see in the physical manifestation of power in the opera house, the way in which these horseshoe theatres privileged the wealthiest people in society, and people would sit at the end of the horseshoes, not to get a better view of the stage, but to be seen by other people who were less well off than they are. And also, I mean, one just has to reflect on something like the fact that we discovered recently that Handel, who of course is so close to us for so many reasons, given that so many of his pieces were premiered here, Covent Garden, himself had shares in the Royal African Company. That's something that we found out recently. And I think we have to be really, really aware of the way in which our history has been glossed over, and the way in which practitioners, composers have been sidelined and literally not being given a voice. Now, in terms of performers on stage, we have managed to have some of the most brilliant, diverse singers the world has ever seen on our stage. But that means that we have an even greater responsibility to do more in that area. And there's some great work in terms of our Young Artists Programme in bringing those younger singers through, those diverse voices through. But more needs to be done. And I think that particularly now we're looking at creative teams, we're looking at composers, we're looking at those voices that haven't been heard. One reflects on the fact that there have been so many average pieces by white men which have been staged or heard in this place in the last few decades. Conversely, there are some really fabulous pieces by black composers which have never been heard, which I've been hearing for the first time in the last few months. So it's a big project for us, and it's an urgent project for us. And there's no question that it's something that we need to take much more seriously than we have historically.
I'm very glad to hear that. I think in a similar vein, I've been very pleased to note that you've been introducing a lot more female creatives, whether it be, conductors or directors or whatever else. So I was wondering, is this then, do you think, the kind of future of opera, more of a hopefully diverse team behind the scenes, not just on the stage?
Yeah, of course. I mean, that's the way it should be. And again, opera historically has been a very male-dominated environment, whether you're talking about conductors or composers, and all figures of authority within opera houses. I said earlier that one of the things I think that an opera house should be is reflective of the city that it's in. And as I said before, London is now 40% non-white. And we have a real duty to reflect that in terms of the practitioners who work here, whether that's singers or directors or composers or conductors. And again, the question of the way in which female talent has been sidelined in terms of composition and in terms of conducting is something that we really want to change. And that is an area that I think we're making good progress on. I mean, it's a tragic consequence of the pandemic that we were due to stage Kaya Saariaho's new opera, Innocence, this summer, but we're now unable to do that because the people who are putting it on first, the X Festival, obviously couldn't do that last summer. So we were going to have to find a future season for that. But those big flagship moments on our main stage need to be followed up with a lot more micro activity to make sure that the talent pipelines are working. The talent that definitely exists out there is privileged on our stages in a way that it hasn't been in the past.
Certainly, yeah. I hope that we can see the Sarajevo opera at some point, because I'm a big fan of hers. We just have a few questions from our audience. So just in the last few minutes that we have, our first question is, how well do you think the opera industry, not just in the UK, but across the world, has responded to the pandemic?
How well?
Mm-hmm.
That's a good question. I mean, I think it depends on which country you're in.
Yeah.
I think that is in turn a function of the funding model that the opera company that we're talking about has. I mean, a lot of attention has been paid to what's happened in New York at the Met, and the very drastic measures that were taken there to save the organisation financially, effectively. But I mean, that's come at enormous cost to many people in that organisation. But on the other hand, I'm sure that action was not taken in any way lightly. But they've made the decision now that they'll be going dark until the beginning of the 21-22 season. So, but that was the decision they had to take, probably because they're not subsidised. They receive no government subsidy, so they have very little protection in a situation like this. Probably they have no alternative. I don't know the ins and outs. Whereas in Germany, of course, there's much more subsidy, and playing operas live streamed with no audiences is much more of a financial proposition. But some people have come up with some really interesting ideas, like in Zurich, where Barry Kosky directed Boris Godunov, where they have the chorus and the orchestra in a separate space. I mean, that's a really imaginative solution to the problem. I mean, probably it's not one that conductors would be crazy about to follow up in the next few years. But as a temporary solution, it's really imaginative to do that. And you look at other houses like Madrid, for example, where I think they're the only company in the whole of Europe who are now making work. And you've got to credit them with persevering and making work in a way that seems to be safe, and getting the support from the local government to do that. But often opera making has been impossible because of a lack of income, or because of government guidelines. So again, I think you've got to look at each individual case and each individual area to judge whether that company has done well. And of course, that's in turn a subjective opinion, isn't it?
Certainly, yeah. Our next question is, do you think that opera has a problem in attracting young audiences?
Put bluntly, I think yes. And I think it's often seen as a fogyish art form. Interestingly enough, that was certainly my perception of the art form before I saw my first one. It wasn't something that kind of grabbed me as an experience to go and see an opera for whatever reason, whereas I'd love to go and see a play. And I think that's partly because of prejudice, actually, because of all of those things that you see in cartoons or adverts. But it's also the fact that opera is an expensive thing to go and see. And that in turn is because it's an expensive art form to put on. I think you actually get pretty good value when you pay 100 quid and you get a whole orchestra and a chorus and artists, the best artists in the world singing. It's not bad value, actually, I think. But it is expensive. And I think that when you're 18, 19, 20, that the pricing could be off-putting. I think the fact that, we like different things at different times in our lives. Lots of people are quite open-minded to opera when they're at school, for example, or when they're at home and they're kids. And then it becomes an uncool thing, doesn't it, opera? And people would much rather go and party and do that, which is fine. And then maybe when you're in a slightly more sedate period in your life, when you've got kids or your kids are left home, it suddenly seems like a more attractive proposition than when you're in your 20s and you want to go and party. So, and I don't think we should be too apologetic about that. I think opera can appeal to different people at different stages in their lives. But I think we do need to make more of an effort to attract a younger crowd. And that's to do with the way in which we present works. It's also about how we welcome audiences into our building and how we make them feel less intimidating. But that's a big project.
Yeah, I certainly agree. So we have two more questions. The first one is, who do you think are the most exciting opera directors working around the world today?
I can't answer that question.
Fair enough.
That would be invidious for me to name names, I think, because there are so many brilliant directors out there. I mean, the one thing I would say is I was thrilled at the directors that we had for our short programs in October. They're all fabulous directors in their own ways, who all have very different personalities and identities, and it was great to get them all together in the same project, basically. And also, I should also mention Barry, and he's someone who can really get the best out of performers and has this brilliant energy and imagination, and we're so excited to be welcoming him back here for future projects. So he would certainly be someone on my list, along with those practitioners who we've recently worked with.
Yeah. What about any up and coming names we should be watching out for?
Well, I include Ola Ince in that, who worked on The Knife of Dawn, the Hannah Kendall piece. She's a really exciting talent. Adele Thomas, who directed Apollo and Daphne in Fall 4, is someone who I saw do some plays when I was in Northern Ireland, and then invited her to Northern Ireland to do Così fan tutte, and she's really got a big opera brain and responds in a really, really imaginative way to opera, and again brings a lot of energy. So she's a great talent, and someone we're looking forward to developing a relationship with in the next few years.
Very last question, which is, do you have any advice for up and coming opera directors and how to get into the opera industry?
I think boundless determination and a willingness to take knocks along the way, and also a willingness to be open to finding your own path. Because I've said before, there is no single path to being a director or to being an artistic director. I think it's about being open to as many opportunities as you can be, learning from as many people as you can, making your own work, whatever it takes to do that. And that is really hard, especially right now, of course. But finding that producer, finding that conductor, finding a designer, finding collaborators, I think that's so important. You know, finding a team. It's so much easier for your headspace and for your morale if you've got a team to work with. And opera it's a team. It's a team sport. It has to be. You know, you can't do it on your own. But just being really, really determined and getting a good group around you, I think would be my advice. Yeah.
Well, Oliver Mears, thank you so much for joining us. This has really been a great talk, and we talked about so many different themes. It's been truly a pleasure to speak to you.
Likewise. Well, it's been a pleasure to be here, and thanks very much for your time.
No, thank you. So that concludes our fourth event of Opera in Conversation. Be sure to join us for our final event of term, which is a panel. So far, we haven't actually announced the people appearing on the panel, but I can now confirm that we will be featuring James Clutton from Opera Holland Park, Elaine Kidd from the Opera House, and Nicola Candlish from British Youth Opera. We'll be talking about broad themes of how opera has responded to 2020, as well as the main theme of young people and opera. So be sure to not miss that. And that will be on Monday, the 30th of November at 5 p.m. Thank you very much, everyone, for tuning in. I've been Zelina Vuliami, and good night. Thank you.
Thank you, Selena. Thank you, Oliver. All links in the description. Please be sure to like and subscribe to this video, and we'll see you next time. Have a great rest of your day.